Good afternoon and welcome to World Oregon's webinar today, Climate Action, is the US Reengaging the World, with partners from the US Department of State and the Oregon Environmental Council, where we'll be excited to be have them join us shortly for an in-depth discussion. Before we do, just a reminder that today is one of a series of World Oregon webinars due to the support of members like you. If you're not a member already, encourage you to go to the worldoregon.org website and become or renew your membership. This is a free webinar. It will be recorded and posted on YouTube later for sharing, and encourage you to share that with someone who might be interested but didn't have a chance to join us today. As we head into summer, we are having a little slower schedule of webinars, but we still have another great one coming up in June with our partners Outright Action International for Pride Month. It's Pride with a Purpose, a global lens, with some experts zooming in from around the world. That's at June 30th. It's a little bit earlier than normal. It's at 10 a.m. Pacific, and that's because of our international experts joining in. Just we have to be respectful of the time zones in the countries they're coming from. So that's on our website, again, June 30th. I also want to note that we are looking for hosts, virtual hosts that is, for a youth international exchange program with Iraqi young leaders and adult mentors. Some of you might have hosted adults or youth in the past in your home. Well, because of the pandemic, they're not able to travel here in person, so we're asking for virtual hosts. It's a great way, if you haven't been involved, to join in helping be an ambassador for your community. We will post a little bit later the link in the chat on how you can apply to be considered a host. Again, that's coming up in July, but we are asking people to apply now so we can get all the slots filled for virtual hosts, either for the youth or the adult mentors. So that would be another great way to be engaged. So those are the things coming up on our agenda in the next couple weeks. Today's program is specifically about climate change. And this is an issue that we continue to tackle as an organization through our public programs and our exchange programs, and we're thrilled to be partnering with the Oregon Environmental Council. You may not know their executive director, Diana Nunez, is a relatively recent joined our board of trustees, and her colleague, Nora Apter, who's the climate program director, will be in conversation with our primary speaker, Brian Ratcliffe, who's a presidential management fellow with the Department of State's Office of Global Change. And so Brian will be talking about the current administration's policy and approach to climate action, how that may differ from the past administrations. And then Nora will come on after about 15-20 minutes and go into discussion with Brian. And then, as always, our program director, Tim DeRoche, will be posting questions for the two of them from the audience. So encourage you to post your questions for the speakers in the Q&A function of Zoom. We will post, again, in the chat function, links to different things that may be of interest to this program. So listen to a great program. Post your questions in the Q&A and get ready for a rich discussion. Without further ado, I'd love to have Brian join me on screen. I'm going to drop off and we'll give the floor to you to talk to us about the current approach to climate action.
Thank you so much, Derek. And good afternoon, everybody. It's really great to be here. And thank you to Nora for joining the discussion. I'm very excited to hear your perspective and to be able to connect a little later on. So like Derek mentioned, my name is Brian Ratcliffe. I am a Presidential Management Fellow currently on assignment with the State Department's Office of Global Change, which leads international climate engagement for the US government. I'd love to talk to you today about three different topics. So the first section I'm going to get into is just acknowledging the crisis, really grounding us in a shared understanding of the current state of play with respect to the climate crisis. And then I'd like to get into what we've done, meaning the response of the US government under the leadership of President Biden. I'd like to peel back the curtain a little bit on what the Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate has been doing, because I think it's really exciting and interesting work. And then I'll round up with what comes next. I'd love to share some thoughts on the road ahead. What are we hoping to get out of this big UN climate negotiations event happening in November. And then we'll open it up and hopefully have a really fun discussion. So yeah, acknowledging the crisis. I don't imagine this will be new to any of you, but humans are causing climate change. One of the ways that we measure how far along we are in causing climate change is to look at the amount of CO2, the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. So pre-industrial revolution, that number was around 280 parts per million. As of last month, that number is now 419 parts per million. So that level represents an all-time high in human history, which is particularly notable, I should say, because that is despite the economic downturn coming from the pandemic recession. The last time there were the concentrations of greenhouse gases were this high was 4 million years ago, when the temperature of the planet was about 4 degrees Celsius higher than it is now, and the sea levels were about 80 feet higher. So this is a real departure from all of human history for us. Now, we're not there yet when it comes to the temperature rise. So far, the global average temperature has gone up by about 1.2 degrees since the pre-industrial period. Which is a hard thing to communicate sometimes. I mean, 1.2 degrees doesn't sound like a lot, but it turns out that represents a really enormous amount of extra energy in our atmosphere. And the effects of that are already causing all kinds of chaos. And I mean, you in Oregon know this better than just about anybody else. I mean, just to take one example, the 2020 wildfire season was absolutely devastating. It burned over 1 million acres in Oregon alone. It burned 10 million acres across the American West. California had 5 of the 6 largest wildfires in its history in 1 year. So obviously these are really extreme events, and they're being exacerbated by the drought, the really historic drought that's gripping the West right now, which again, you don't need me to tell you that. 90% of Oregon is abnormally dry or worse, according to the US Drought Monitor. And you have 15 counties under emergency drought declaration. So this is something you're living. This is something that Americans across the country are living in, of course, around the world. I think I won't belabor it further. I have a whole list of like climate calamities that are going on, but I think the point is made. I think you understand what we're dealing with. The one thing I do want to emphasize on this before we move on is just that the impacts of these climate damages, it doesn't land evenly, right? This isn't affecting everybody in the same way. Low-income communities and communities of color, both here and abroad, are disproportionately receiving the brunt of this, which is a real justice issue. It's a real moral issue, especially when you consider that globally speaking, some of the most vulnerable countries are the least responsible for causing climate change. So this notion of environmental justice is central to this administration's understanding of how we understand the climate crisis and how we respond to it. So again, I just returning to this 1.2 degrees number, like, so something that's I think very important to note here is that we don't have a lot of slack in the rope left. So scientists are telling us loud and clear that we have to limit global temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius. There used to be a whole a debate that maybe 2 degrees was the safe threshold, but that the science has really evolved just in the last several years to telling us that no, the difference between warming of 1.5 degrees versus 2 is really, really profound. Just to take one example among thousands, this is from a special report put out by the IPCC a couple of years ago. If the planet warms by 1.5 degrees, we will lose something like 70 to 90% of all coral reefs. If the planet warms by 2 degrees, we lose 99% or more. And that severity, that degree of difference is playing itself out in ecosystems and communities all around the world. So anyway, again, I won't belabor it, but keeping to 1.5 is absolutely essential. And the good news is that we can do it. So there are a lot of different reports that have come out recently by a lot of different entities that are unanimous in agreeing that maintaining a 1.5 degree, world is possible. And they all have a caveat, right? Which is that it's very hard to do. Like it takes we are going to have to spend the next 3 decades extremely wisely to make that happen. Because here's the upshot, right? Like if 1.5 is the goal, then the how we get there is we have to drive overall global emissions down to 0 by 2050. That's the result of all kinds of computer modeling and different exercises that show that we stand a really good shot at keeping that temperature threshold if we're able to reduce emissions to zero by 2050. And the reason I'm really hitting this hard is like, this is our North Star. As far as the Biden administration is concerned, as far as the US government's approach to this, that is our goal. I mean, we see that as the imperative here. So I'm gonna move on. I think that's enough of the situation. This is, we're not here to talk about how bad things might get. We're here to talk about what the Biden administration is doing about it. So in this, what we've done so far section, I'd really like to highlight 3 milestones. And there's 1,000 things I could have highlighted. It's been a very busy 5 months, but there's 3 things in particular I'd like to highlight. The first is that President Biden re-entered the Paris Agreement. The second thing is that President Biden created the Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. And then the third is that President Biden hosted a leaders summit on climate back in April. And I'll sort of elaborate on all 3 of those, again, picking amongst the hundreds I could have chosen. So milestone 1, rejoining the Paris Agreement. So on his first day in office, literally President Biden, coming home from inauguration, signed the paperwork that got us back into the Paris Agreement. So with a stroke of a pen, he brought us back into the single best mechanism that we have for coordinating the international efforts to tackle climate change. A quick aside about the Paris Agreement here, because it's useful for understanding stuff we'll talk about later. As you may be aware, so there is no central Paris body that dictates how participating parties go about, addressing climate change. Instead, all of the parties to the Paris Agreement have an obligation to determine their own contribution, the creatively called Nationally Determined Contribution, or NDC. It's an awkward acronym, but you can think of it as the climate target. Each country comes up with its own climate target. So by re-entering the Paris Agreement, one of the first things we had to do was update our climate target, our NDC. And we came back swinging. So in April, President Biden announced our new climate target, and it is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, 50 to 52% by 2030, which is extraordinarily ambitious. It's twice as aggressive as the previous NDC we had under the Obama administration. And it puts us near the front of the pack in terms of ambition of these climate goals. And that came on top of other commitments that he made, including decarbonizing, getting rid of all of the carbon pollution from the electricity sector by 2035, and committing us to that net zero target by 2050. So right out the gate, we re-entered the Paris Agreement, announced an extremely ambitious NDC, which was really the beginning of our reasserting our climate leadership in a pretty major way. And the good news is that while the US only represents something like 4% of the world's population, we contribute nearly 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions. We are the second largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions behind China. And so if we do our part at home and we have this ambitious target, we can make a significant contribution. Now, the bad news is that, if we represent 15%, then the rest of the world is 85%. And we could go to net zero tomorrow and we would still lose this fight if other countries didn't go along, right? If we don't address the emissions coming from elsewhere in the world. And so that is why we need an all-out diplomatic effort to bring the rest of the world on board. So that brings me to milestone 2, which is the creation of the Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. So very shortly after his election, President Biden named John Kerry as the new and first ever Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. We've had special envoys for climate in the past, but Kerry's the first one at the presidential level who has a seat on the National Security Council. And the fundamental task of him and his office is to lead the diplomatic efforts to reassert US climate leadership and raise global ambition. And I mean, Special Envoy Kerry is ludicrously qualified for this role. He was a senator for nearly 3 decades. He was the Secretary of State after that. He's extraordinarily experienced. And more than any of that, honestly, to me, it's his passion. It's his personal passion for this work that is, I find, truly inspiring. I mean, he could be retired right now, and instead he's working 80-hour weeks, week after week, trying to really tackle this enormous challenge. His leadership is really inspiring, but I guess actually what I really want to drive home here is that he's not working alone. he has a remarkable team of climate experts working alongside him, with more coming on board every day. And it's a mix, right, of seasoned statesmen and women, people who have been in the office or in these kinds of roles for decades, and then a mix of fresh new talent as well, representing a variety of sectors. And they're divided into these teams. I mean, the climate crisis is such a dizzyingly complex thing that it really does require a like multi-pronged approach. So I won't go into the full detail of it, but I think it's really cool the way the office is structured. We have a whole team just dedicated to the negotiations issues. So this November in Glasgow at this big UN climate conference, there's all kinds of thorny, subtle, wonky issues that need to get negotiated and hammered out. And we have an entire team just dedicated to what are our positions, how we're going to get people on board. We have a whole team on this question of like bilateral engagement and ambition, right? We have a list of countries who we are engaging with very strategically, very deliberately to bring them along. We have two different teams for finance because it's not cheap to solve the climate crisis. We have a team working on public finance, right? Getting the governments, particularly of developed countries, to honor their commitment to provide billions and billions of dollars a year in climate finance. And then on the other side, we have a private sector team working to channel the trillions and trillions of dollars of private sector money that is frankly looking for a way to be directed towards this effort. We have a team working on nature-based solutions because there's no way to get to 1.5 if you don't really invest in protecting and restoring nature. We have a whole team devoted to innovation because a lot of the technologies that we're going to need to solve this problem aren't yet at commercial scale, right? They're not ready for prime time. And so we need to really be investing in research and development and putting a lot of energy into the good ideas that are going to help us tomorrow. So anyway, I could go on and on. But I just wanted to give you a peek at this office. There's not a lot of details that have been revealed about this yet. But I wanted to highlight that Special Envoy Kerry is an extraordinary individual, but so are the people around him working to make all of this work. So I think you'll get a better sense of the value of this office if I talk about one event in particular, because I think it sort of serves as a microcosm. So the third milestone that I want to talk about is the Leaders Summit on Climate. So back in April, just in time for Earth Day and before the end of the first 100 days he was in office, President Biden hosted a virtual Leaders Summit on Climate. And the goal here was really to bring together the major emitters, right? There's 196 something parties to the Paris Agreement, but they're not all polluting evenly, right? So there's a much smaller number of about 17 countries who collectively are responsible for 80% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So the idea is bring those major emitters to the table and basically get them to sit around a virtual table and commit to each other, like, what are you gonna do? What are we gonna do about this crisis? And so in the run up to this summit, the members of the Special Envoys team and the members of the Office of Global Change, where I work, we were rushing about trying to secure these commitments. We had a whole list of countries we were engaging with, and we wanted everyone to bring as much as they could to the table to really make this summit a success. I had the privilege of participating on our bilateral engagements with Canada. And I'd like to share just a little bit about that experience because I think it's illustrative of the kinds of engagement that the Special Envoy's office is undertaking both then and now. So again, back at the time, we're talking February, March of this year, we were looking to find key partners who would join us and really make the summit a success, right? And Canada really fit the bill. They're a very close ally, of course. They have a similar sorts of economic challenges to the US. They are serious about climate, but, and this is critical, the nationally determined contribution, their climate target at the time, we thought they could go further than they were. So their target at the time was to reduce their emissions by 30% by the year 2030, which is not bad, but it's not on track to keep climate change to 1.5. And so I'll spare you the play-by-play, but it was a really cool experience for several weeks. So we met with our State Department colleagues at the embassies in Canada to learn what they knew. We worked closely in the interagency with the EPA, with the US Forest Service. We worked with some modelers and scientists at some research universities, all trying to come up with good ideas, right? And show them as clearly as we could, like, here here's how you can increase your ambition, and not just like, we want you to do it, so do it, but like, here's the data, here's the policies that you could change. Like, we're here to help you, help us help you, sort of thing. So anyway, the day of the Leader Summit arrives. On that first day, all of the heads of state gave these remarks. And so Prime Minister Trudeau's face appears on the screen and he starts talking. And we in this moment, we don't know like what the outcome is going to be of all of this like heavy diplomatic engagement. And then he gets to making his new announcement, and the announcement is 40 to 45% reductions in emissions by 2030, which was an improvement of almost 1.5 based on where it was before. We were completely thrilled by that. So I'm not here claiming that was all because of our work, but we exercised strong leadership and collaboration, and then at the end of the day, Canada's ambition took a big step forward. And then here's really the point I'm trying to make, is like, that was happening in parallel in so many other countries. And in a lot of the cases, we were able to really help ratchet things up. So the upshot is that at the end of the day, with our new target of, remember, 50 to 52% by 2030, and Canada's target and new commitments from the EU and the UK and Japan and others, more than 50% of the global economy now had commitments that were in line with the pace of action that we need to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees, which was not the case before, right? So it was a huge undertaking, and it had some really measurable progress. And I think what I love about that milestone is that it really represents this moment that was both substantively and symbolically important. Substantively, because it literally, countries pledged gigatons worth of emissions reductions, billions of new dollars for finance. There were tons of new programs and initiatives launched that I didn't even have time to get into. So a real impact was made. But then also symbolically, I feel like it really heralded the return of US leadership in the climate space in this way that is really necessary. And it helped build excitement, and it built momentum towards this big UN summit in November. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what comes next. This is the third part of my talk. And with the time that I have left, I'd like to talk a bit about the next few months, because the work doesn't stop. So for those of you doing the math a minute ago, I just said that, right, a little over half of the world's economy is now in line with 1.5. That means, of course, that a little less than half of the world is still not, right? It does not yet have the plans in place to get us where we need to be, right? And that's a problem. And in a funny way, we've picked some of the lowest hanging fruit. There are some really challenging situations out there that have to be solved. We just don't have an option, actually. And so our work is really cut out for us. Getting a strong outcome at this year's UN climate conference is super important. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but the one I'll focus on is, so this is another kind of nuance of the Paris Agreement. So these NDCs, countries are supposed to revise them every 5 years. And it turns out that this COP, this conference coming up in November, is the 5th one since Paris itself. And so this is the year when all of these parties to this Paris Agreement are revising their climate plans. And so we want to make sure that they are as ambitious as possible, that they are all aligned with this goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050, so that we can keep 1.5 degrees in reach. Because if we can't, no one wants to live in the world, where we don't meet this goal. And so it's just the all-out diplomatic efforts continue. Because the other important thing here is, like, it's not just the target. It's not just, okay, I will have XYZ outcome by XYZ date. It's like, okay, how are you going to do that though? Like, what is the roadmap? We don't want to just hear you say, like, yeah, here's our intention. Like, I feel like it's very easy to make a promise, and our goal is to encourage everybody to have as detailed a plan as possible so that you follow through on that, because we all sink or swim together here. It's time to pivot from like plan making to implementation. And that's really what we're hoping to drive in Glasgow. And look, the stakes are just too high to mess this up. Like, we can and will do what's necessary to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. That is our goal. So that's my rundown. The Biden administration acknowledges the climate crisis. And in the first 5 months of its administration, it has made measurable progress towards raising ambition, both at home and abroad. And we have a clear plan for what comes next in the critical months leading to this November's climate conference. So thank you for letting me share some words today. I trimmed out a lot more than I included because there's so much to say here. So I really do look forward to continuing the conversation with Nora and with getting your questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian, and hello, everybody. So happy to be here, and just wow, what a really incredible presentation, Brian. It's so important to have your insight and to feel excited about all the progress that is happening on the global stage. Just quickly again, my name is Nora Apter. I'm the Climate Program Director for the Oregon Environmental Council. And I'm so excited to be able to kick us off with some questions to you, Brian. I think just maybe as a little personal context and explanation before I get hopefully not too cynical, I worked as an environmental policy advocate at the federal level during all 4 years of the Trump administration, and cannot tell you the number of sleepless nights I spent wondering how we could possibly begin to repair the damage wreaked on our cornerstone environmental laws and climate protections, let alone make the progress needed to effectively reduce our emissions and avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So I think that makes it all the more impressive and worth celebrating that the Biden administration has already begun to pave the way for significant climate action, not just here at home, but globally. That being said, 4 years is a long time for the US to have been absent from the global climate community, including global climate negotiations and international efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think, understandably, that has left a gap in our international leadership and credibility. So it's so exciting to hear all of the progress, but I'm interested if you could speak to some of the challenges that go along with kind of rebuilding that credibility on the world stage, as well as maybe any countries that might have stepped up in our absence, any like new partners that are helping to lead the way in encouraging stronger goals and actions across the world.
Fantastic question, Nora. I do apologize. My wireless headphones kicked out in the middle of your thing, so I caught 90% of it, but I missed a little bit in the end. But I'll answer what I heard, and then if I missed something critical, please just let me know. And just let me know. Okay, are you hearing me? Okay. Coming through a different mic now. Apologize for that. Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, your point is extremely well made. The absence of U.S. leadership in this space during the prior administration did cost us. I would say there's a couple reasons for hope or things that I think helped to mitigate that or soften that. One is that the non-governmental space really lit up. I feel like the private sector businesses and the financial sector and other actors in the private sector space are well aware of the stakes of this and have begun their own efforts to make sure that their actions are aligned with net zero. And so I think that there has been a real acceleration of the kinds of work from the private sector, which I think is interesting. I mean, the states did incredible work during this time. The We Are Still In coalition of governors, I think, was absolutely instrumental in sending the message to the rest of the world, right, that there may have been a temporary abdication of leadership from a particular office, but that actually the majority of Americans still want to see action on this issue, that we're not walking away from this. And so plus when you're talking about, the governors or the states of California and New York, you're talking about massive economies that are larger than a lot of countries. And so when those subnational governments are still behaving in alignment with the Paris Agreement, that really carries a lot of weight. And then the other thing I would say, just in terms of, I think you were mentioning something about rebuilding trust, like something I've really remarked upon in watching Special Envoy Kerry in his international diplomacy is the extent of humility that he carries. All of these meetings, especially the early ones, began with some version of like, I'm sorry. I mean, there wasn't any kind of swagger. There wasn't any kind of like, aren't you so glad we're back? Like, I think there really is a profound feeling of humility that that a lot of other states were left carrying a lot of the water in our absence, and that it was a very unsettling and frightening time for a lot of people. And so anyway, I think that combination of humility and like, let's get to work, right? Let's roll up our sleeves. I think that has really helped to build some of those bridges. So I hope that answers most of the questions you asked. And again, sorry to cut out there.
No, that I think you hit everything and even more. I'm really glad that you hit on, in particular, the influence of US subnational actors, including, the state of Oregon, as you mentioned, the Oregon and other states have continued their emissions reduction efforts, or did throughout the Trump administration. So I think it's really important, especially for folks here at home that are advocating for policies at the state and local level, to know that there is a role to play for subnational actors in shaping ambition with our counterparts abroad. So I'm really glad you hit on that.
Well, yeah, and if I may just add one thing to that, and there's a little bit of a minefield, so I need to be careful, and maybe I'll regret having brought this up. But one example, I think, of very interesting, just to respond to your last point of subnational engagement with the rest of the world, there's an entity called the California-China Climate Institute, which is doing some really impressive work connecting the state of California and researchers there and policymakers with their counterparts in China. Obviously, the federal relationship between the United States and China right now is tense, but there is still a lot of progress being made at this subnational level in ways that, frankly, are very impressive and give me a lot of hope. So yeah, there are really creative ways that subnational actors really help to fill that gap.
Thanks, Brian. I'm curious, so as you noted, in just the first 150 days of this new administration, we've already seen a really just significant sea change when it comes to climate, including at the domestic level, right? So we've seen, of course, Biden's recent executive orders on climate, even Biden's infrastructure plan, the American Jobs Plan includes, it's just incredibly climate focused in terms of how we as a country are going to prioritize our investments as we're in this stage of rebuilding. So I'm curious how those domestic climate actions translate into, soft power in influencing international allies. And maybe as well, what are the limitations of that type of executive action in influencing other countries to act?
Fantastic questions, Nora. I'm really glad you mentioned the executive orders. That's one of I almost had that as a milestone, but my speech was just getting so long and something had to go. But yeah, President Biden's executive order on tackling the climate crisis is one of the most breathtaking documents I think I've ever seen. If the people watching haven't yet seen it or are familiar with it, please Google it. The White House has the whole text available online. There's lots of analyses there. It contains such aggressive, ambitious, comprehensive visioning for how to, like it says, tackle the climate crisis both at home and abroad. So, and that's just one of many executive orders that have really helped move the needle on this. And yeah, the infrastructure plan, the American Jobs Plan, is absolutely remarkable as well. So I would say that, to your question about how do these policies, exert a kind of soft power. I mean, so something that the Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken, likes to say is that America leads by the power of our example. And that really feels true here, that it's not credible if we are going around, right, and Special Envoy Kerry is meeting with all these heads of, ministries saying like, you have to do more. But then back home, like if we were to be falling down on our own commitments, like the hypocrisy there is a little rich and I don't think would be welcomed, right? So there's something extremely important about having our own house in order if we're trying to have any credibility moving abroad and really helping to raise global ambition. That said, you hinted in your second question around the limitations of that. I mean, the executive has a lot of power, but the distribution of power in the American system is very deliberate, and Congress holds the power of the purse strings, right? So a lot of this spending, a lot of this ambitious spending in the American Jobs Plan is contingent on there being legislation passed by Congress to make it so. And so there's obviously limits as appropriate. There should be, right, limits on executive authority there. And so I think that it's been impressive to me to see the way that the Special Envoy's office has productive relationships with the Hill. And I think that there is a lot of, I think there's still a feeling of collaboration, like let's see what we can get, and a feeling of pragmatism as well. So yeah, those are some of my initial responses.
Thanks so much, Brian. Yeah, I'm glad that you hit on the just, I guess, the elephant in the room being Congress. I worked on the Hill for some time and am all too aware of usually rightful criticisms of congressional inaction, especially in the climate space. And to your point, going back to the NDCs and the need for those, not just to say these are our goals, but really here's how we're going to get there. The Congress is clearly a very important part of that for the US. I'm curious, in thinking about where we have seen consistent bipartisan support or action in Congress, one piece of kind of annual must-pass legislation that comes to mind is the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. And I bring that up because I know that President Biden's executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, which I did put a link in the chat to, and as you said, would definitely encourage people to check that out. But the first part of that executive order really focuses on establishing a policy of putting the climate crisis at the center of US foreign policy, which you spoke a lot to, but also national security. And I think folks may be less familiar of what that nexus really looks like. And I think that, again, going back to where we have seen opportunities for bipartisan support on things like the NDAA, really putting a fine point on what the opportunities here are to incorporate and prioritize climate action as part of national security is really important to hone in on. So I don't know if you have any specifics that you might share in terms of what that looks like in practice.
Sure. Yeah, Nora, great questions. And I'm really glad you did bring this up because I think it's an underappreciated dimension that climate change makes existing security challenges worse, right? And that there is a strong climate and security dimension. And I think that honestly, the US military is very aware of that. And it's one of the reasons why there is much more appetite within the military community for taking action on climate. I mean, because look, wherever there's existing conflict, especially conflict over resource scarcity, mixing in droughts or heavy rains, floods that cause the loss of crops. I mean, even sea level rise that consumes cities or communities, leading to migration. I mean, there are real challenges in terms of the destabilization that can happen. Sometimes climate change is called a crisis multiplier. You take a situation that's already pretty tough for reasons that are totally separate from climate, and then you add this in and it just makes it harder. And so, I mean, and not just that, but climate change can also create whole new theaters for conflict. I mean, just in last February, a Russian gas tanker sailed through the Arctic's northern sea route for the first time ever, right? So there's this whole new channel where now there's the potential for there to be challenging, conflicts of interest and things like that. And so anyway, that connection is very well made. And I think that honestly, it just adds more fuel to the fire under us in terms of bringing emissions down. And I mean, the other thing that I didn't talk as much about in my prepared remarks, but which is very important to highlight here is so there's two pieces to responding to the climate change. I mean, one of them is getting our emissions down to stop the driving of the thing itself. But then the other is look, we're already going to be seeing a lot of impacts of climate. We're seeing them now, they're going to get worse. We have to build up resilience. We have to harden our vulnerable places to the extent that we can. And so I think funding and investment in that kind of work can help. And I mean, you get double dividends there too, right? Because you're also preventing future conflict in those areas. So I will say that I think as a result of one of those EOs, although I'll have to sort of track back to where this came from, but I do know that the State Department and the Department of Defense are right now working on a report on the security implications of climate change. So I think it's probably safe to say that the administration is still working out exactly what our stance is there, but it's something we're paying quite a lot of attention to.
Thank you, Brian. Well, I've focused a lot on some of the challenges that exist because there are many, but I also I want to maybe end this part of our Q&A on a positive note. And you just hit on President Biden's International Climate Finance Plan, which, as you noted, will play such, I can imagine, a critical role in making sure that we are helping to enhance not just emissions reduction, but also climate adaptation projects abroad. So I wonder if there's anything along those lines that you could highlight in terms of the role of this climate finance plan in enhancing and advancing global climate action.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, it is right at the heart of it. I mean, we are asking countries to do very hard things, but both of these things that I just talked about, right? Like change. So when we're talking about reducing emissions, what does that actually mean? I mean, in many cases, it means changing over your energy infrastructure. In a lot of places, it is the generation of electricity that generates enormous amounts of the greenhouse gases. And so if you're talking about retiring coal power plants or retiring natural gas facilities, and then building something else, I mean, that's all well and good, but it costs a lot of money. And a lot of these countries are, I mean, they built out a lot of this fossil fuel infrastructure because it was the most affordable option to begin with. And the alternative, right? Like the alternative is unacceptable, meaning like no electricity or no, like there's no sense in which depriving whole regions of a kind of reasonable standard of living is acceptable. And so energy has to be had, food has to be grown, transportation, like these things have to happen. They must happen in ways that are zero carbon. And so that transition, it just costs money. And so, and a lot of these countries just don't have the resources domestically to do that. Nor, I mean, and they would make the argument that like, they are not responsible for this mess in the first place. And so there is a feeling of like the developed countries, well, I guess I'll just say that like, we are very committed. We have a deep understanding of, we have the capacity to lend financial support, and there are a lot of recipient countries who desperately need it. And it's in our interests to find that capital and let it flow to them so that they can develop their clean economies. I mean, but then the other half of it, right, this adaptation piece, when a hurricane wipes out your entire village or decimates, I mean, gosh, one of the factoids that I skipped over earlier, but which just blows my mind, is that in 2019, here in the US, flooding in the Midwest caused something like 19 million acres of land that would have been planted to go unplanted. I mean, we lost 19 million acres of the best farmland in the country. And, you know, imagine that happening to a much smaller country with fewer resources. I mean, the effects of this are truly, in some cases, truly existential. And so finding the financial resources to help that adaptation is really essential. And so, yeah, we are very committed. I mean, there was a commitment made a decade ago by developed countries to provide $100 billion a year of climate assistance. And we have yet to meet that mark, but we're getting close, and it's very much our goal to help make sure that that happens. Yeah, more to say, but I guess I'll leave it there.
Great. Hey, this is Tim DeRoche, Director of Programs for World Oregon. I'm going to jump in. We've got some great questions coming in from the audience. A few that are lingering along the periphery. Please, if you do have more questions as they are answering them, put them into the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. I want to start with a question that Nora actually fielded earlier, but we haven't gotten to yet, which is, you know, the thing that brings us all here today. We're here by Zoom, and we're here by Zoom because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the pandemic has underscored the fact that the crises of climate change, public health, and systemic racism are all inextricably interlinked. Climate impacts are already worsening public health outcomes here in Oregon, while disproportionately impacting BIPOC and other vulnerable communities. So what lessons, and this is a question for both of you, what lessons can we learn from the COVID-19 pandemic that can help us flatten the climate curve?
Nora, I've done a lot of answering of questions. Would you like to take this one? Otherwise, I'm happy to.
Sure. Yeah, feels a little weird answering my own question, but I do think it is really important. And there are a lot of lessons to be learned. First and foremost, I think following the science in shaping our policies, which is something that thankfully the new administration is committed to doing. We have clear science-backed emissions reduction targets that can be and should be our guiding path in determining the actions that we need to take in the near term, and most importantly, that tell us we need to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030 to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. I think, yeah, the global pandemic has certainly underscored the importance of ensuring our policies are backed by science. They've also underscored the need to act quickly and to get ahead of the curve, or to flatten the curve rather, as well as the fact that really all of these crises are in many ways inextricably interlinked, right? We know that climate change is worsening public health outcomes. We've seen that even in direct relation to COVID-19 impacts, and it's disproportionately affecting our communities. And that's certainly true in the United States. And I've been really glad and impressed to see the Biden administration threading that through really all of the actions that they've taken so far on climate, in terms of ensuring that equitable outcomes and prioritizing BIPOC and low income and other disproportionately impacted communities has really been front and center. And Brian, I was really excited to hear, all that you were sharing in terms of, how that sort of equity lens is shaping our work and investments abroad as well. Of course, it looks different on the international level, but I think COVID has underscored the real need for that to be front and center in our policymaking.
That's extremely well said, Nora. The only things I would add to what you said, I think that both the COVID-19 crisis and the climate crisis offer us opportunities in how we respond, right? I'm a big fan of the frame of Build Back Better, because what it acknowledges is that the pre-crisis status quo was actually not all that, well, certainly not all that equitable, and I mean, not even survivable for some people. So I think that there's a sense in which, rather than returning to before, let's just get back to where we were. I think that for most people of color, both in this country and abroad, the pre-pandemic and pre-climate crisis status quo was extremely dangerous, right? And so we have this opportunity now in the investments that we're making, both to resuscitate the economy after the pandemic recession, but then also the $1 trillion investments we're making to respond to the climate crisis. By directing those strategically, we can help to undo some of the historical harm that's existed. And I think that's maybe one of the most important parallels. And it makes me think of one of the things in one of the aspects to the EO on tackling the climate crisis that I really, really appreciate, which is this thing called the Justice 40 initiative. And the idea is we're about to spend trillions of dollars investing in clean energy, public transportation, et cetera, and there's a commitment by the Biden administration to ensure that at least 40% of the benefits of that federal investment go to disadvantaged communities, which to me is this administration living into that value. Like, it's one thing to say environmental justice matters. It's one thing to say that we are trying to center people of color in the decision making and in the outcomes, but it's another thing to literally put our money where our mouth is and say that the investments we're making are going to be flowing in this direction to undo past harm.
So we've got another question, and great answers, both of you. We've got a question from someone who is the League of Women Voters UN Observer for Climate, and her question is whether the US is supportive of adding implementation language to Article 6 of the Paris Agreement to address human rights.
I really appreciate that question, and I was wondering if anyone was going to get into the weeds on the Paris Rulebook and on Article 6 in particular. I'm going to do a very annoying thing and dodge that question, only because the Article 6 negotiations are particularly sensitive. Our positions are being, I don't even want to say they're being worked out. Well, they're being worked out by individuals other than me. And I don't want to comment on the ongoing negotiations at this time, but I think in principle, absolutely, human rights are extraordinarily important to this administration. It's why we are so committed to raising ambition on climate change, because the climate crisis will become a human rights crisis, you know. So to that specific point, I'm going to dodge, unfortunately, but I do appreciate the closeness with which you're observing that. And I will say that I have enormous faith in our Article 6 team. It's some of the hardest working, brightest people in our team. And so I have faith that they will guide us to a good outcome, but I don't know about that particular dimension.
Well, Brian, it's funny. I did warn you that you're coming into a Portland audience. They not only are in the weeds, they actually know how to remove the weeds. And you know, you don't mess with the Portland audience when it comes to a discussion about climate. Moving on, the US's nationally determined contributions state it will not participate in carbon markets. So why is that?
I think one answer is that's a little bit weedy as well. I will say that, so the idea of a carbon offset, so just to sort of talk a little bit more broadly, there's the idea that, right, we all have these NDCs, these contributions. They're basically a description of by how much you're going to reduce your emissions by what year. And there's a way of, there are changes and investments you can make that will literally cause your own emissions to go down, say by retiring a coal plant and replacing it with a wind farm. And then there's a whole other sort of way of thinking about how to satisfy the requirements of that NDC. There are mechanisms by which a country can invest in a project in a different country, say a forest restoration project. And so if you were to fund a program, or say a program happened that through proper forest stewardship led to the growth of a bunch of new trees, which pulled a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere, right? That emissions reduction could in some cases be sort of sold to or debited to a different country. So they can claim those emissions reductions that happened over there and count them towards their own NDC. So that's, I think, the idea of what the question is coming to. I don't think I can comment. I frankly just don't know enough about the details that went into the formulation of the NDC in terms of why that particular decision was made. I think that, frankly, if I can hazard a guess, it's that we are deeply committed to making real emissions reductions within the bounds of our country and not relying on emissions reductions happening elsewhere that we can claim, if that makes sense. I don't want to speak for the team that wrote the NDC, but that's an answer that I might hazard.
You know, one of the areas that we didn't really touch on too much was the connections between trade and climate change policy. And here's another good weedy question for you. Especially as we enter back into a global stage. I mean, we're really walking back into some things that, by some people's accounts, we have definitely retreated from. What is the US going to do about other countries imposing border carbon adjustments, such as the EU in 2023?
Tim, you are not lying, man. This is a very erudite audience, and I appreciate that question. This is exactly the kind of question that I ask when I come to these sorts of things. That's a great question. So the idea, again, to buy some time for myself by doing a tiny bit of educating, the idea of what the EU is proposing around the border carbon adjustment mechanism is that they want to discourage. It's a mechanism to discourage leakage. So if you have a stringent carbon, or a stringent climate policy in your country, and as a result, maybe the steel manufacturers in your country, it's more expensive for them to operate because they need to do it in a low carbon way. And and then they try to sell that steel on the, maybe they want to sell that steel domestically, and then there's some country next door doesn't have climate legislation. Their steel is a lot cheaper because they're producing it in a dirtier way, right? They're basically pushing the cost of the production onto the environment instead of internalizing it into the cost of the steel. If they try to, like, if you're a steel buyer in that first country, you're going to go for the cheaper steel, which is not necessarily the greener steel. And so, wow, I'm like really rambling here, but the idea is, if you institute a mechanism where if you're trying to import something that's dirty, you basically pay a fee on top of it so that the costs end up leveling out, so that you're not inadvertently, through your climate policy, hurting your own internal industries. That's the idea of a border adjustment mechanism. I don't think I'm qualified to comment on our stance right now. I think honestly, we're working it out. I mean, I think that, again, if I can hazard a guess, I think that we are appreciative of any and all efforts towards increasing climate ambition. And I mean, the EU has extremely aggressive goals, and we applaud them for that. And the EU sees the imposition of a border carbon adjustment mechanism as a way of ensuring environmental integrity, and while also maintaining their economy. Like that, those aims, I think that we are supportive of. Whether or not the policy itself is something that we are enthusiastic about, I can't comment. But again, really appreciate the question. Y'all are great.
So one last question for both of you. I think I mentioned this when we were coming up with the program. When you have a really big issue like climate change or genocide or human trafficking, it's oftentimes very daunting to not feel small or helpless in the face of something so big. So obviously, addressing climate change is a global effort. It needs support and involvement of governments, industry, NGOs, and everyone around the world. But from both of your perspectives, you've been so engaged and passionate about this. What do you think are the most important ways an individual can support climate change action?
I'm happy to take a first stab at that. I think Brian and I talked a little bit in the Q&A about, the role that state and local governments have played in continuing to make progress on reducing emissions, while we have lacked that leadership at the federal level in the United States. And similarly, how our actions, both at the state level, but the federal level domestically, have influenced our partners at a global level, or have failed to do that in the absence of leadership. And I think what that comes down to is really making sure that we are electing pro-climate officials at every level of government. These are the people who are, the decision makers and able to ensure the kind of systemic policy change necessary to build back better, as Brian was saying, and really make sure that we are enacting the type of climate policy that we need to, based on the science. So I think, voting is really important, and that is entirely a nonpartisan message. We just need to elect people who we have assurances will base policy in science, and enact pro-climate policies. But I think even past elections, just continuing to engage and hold our leaders accountable. We saw a really incredible rise in civic engagement over the last 4 years to try to hold the line against attacks on our cornerstone environmental laws and climate, or attacks on our climate and our environment. But we need to really continue that same level of enthusiasm and action, and making sure that leaders, including President Biden, who has clearly demonstrated a commitment to this issue, continue to hear from people, and really understand that this is a priority for the vast majority of American voters. And that is, similarly important at the state and local level to make sure that we maintain the same level of action and accountability. So not just voting, but making sure that you're continuing to pay attention and engaged as we are in this critical stage of the climate fight.
Wonderful. Brian?
Oh, Yeah, I have very little to add. Nora, I think really said it really beautifully. I guess the things that I would emphasize is that, so President Biden calls this an all-of-government approach, right? It's not, climate change isn't siloed off into one other area. It's really integrated across the government. And really, it's a whole of society approach. I think that we need everybody's help to drive the change. And honestly, like, most of the work is happening at the state and local level, or the ground level. I mean, the federal government, we set targets, we fund things, but I feel like there's the choices around, like, where does your utility get its energy from? Like the local land use planning in your community, like, those are not decisions made at the federal level, nor should they be. And so I think that, yeah, I totally underscore that the point about getting involved, especially with local politics. And yeah, I mean, one sort of organization I might plug is the Race to Zero. So we are trying to get countries to, at the party level, to commit to getting emissions down to net zero by 2050, but there are similar targets at play for businesses and cities and regions, and they come together under the umbrella of the Race to Zero. So I would say, like, look at your workplace, look at your community, like, are you involved in that work? Can you make a plan to get to zero by 2050? And, like, what would that take? So those are some of the thoughts.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both. I mean, your answers just right there. It's a reminder that, as it used to be said, we are the ones that we've been waiting for, that we all own this, we can all be part of it. We needn't wait for somebody else to do something. The permission is all around us. All we have to do is look at the weather in Portland this weekend that is going to reach 110 degrees, and looking at fires that are beginning to brew here and there, that, it's right in front of us, that action is in front of us, and there needs to be a plan. So I want to thank both of you, Brian, for taking the time, Nora for being with us and asking fantastic questions. Want to thank the audience for adding your own, as Brian said, extremely erudite questions to the mix. Take care of yourselves, stay cool, stay healthy, stay well, and we will see you again, hopefully at the end of the month, when we have our program on Pride with Outright Action International. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you so much. It's been a privilege.